Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Lee University. Thanks for being here. It's a beautiful university, really. It's a beautiful day out there as well. So rather than listening to me, you could be out there in the sun, and I appreciate you being here and listening to me instead. On my drive over here, it was kind of snowing part of the time, and it was kind of difficult to get here yesterday. But today is a beautiful day, and I'm really impressed by the campus. So. Thanks for being here. I'm going to be talking about censorship and the supernatural. Edgar Neville's cinematic adaptation of Emilio Carrere's The Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, or in Spanish, La Torre de los Siete Jorobados. This is not a very well-known film. It is not a very well-known novel these days either. I have a copy in Spanish here. It has not been translated into English. This is not a critical edition, but there is a critical edition that probably came out around 1999 or just around the turn of the millennium. I am sure that no one right here in this room has ever heard of the name Emilio Carrere, so I'm going to be giving you a little bit of background on him so that you know who I'm talking about. He was born and died in Madrid. He was born in 1881 and died in 1947, and he was one of the foremost representatives of the Bohemian writers and artists who lived and worked in Madrid in the early to mid 20th century. Many of these writers, in fact, wrote works of dubious quality. If you read a book by Juan Manuel de Prada, which is called Desgarrados y Excéntricos, you will see that they were pretty eccentric writers, a lot of these, and some of the works that they wrote will probably not be remembered. In fact, are not remembered, many of them these days. But of course, among them, there are some names like Alejandro Sawa, Ramón María del Valle Inclán, Ramón Gómez de la Serna, who wrote some really valuable works that are now considered classics. Emilio Carrere is rather obscure today and forgotten, even though there has been a mild recovery of interest in his works as of late, but not enough, in my view. And he was, at the time, one of the most important writers in this group of Bohemians. One of the reasons why Carrere is so underrated and forgotten today may well be that he concentrated on writing popular literature. Another reason is probably political. During the Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939, he claimed that he was insane to avoid taking part in the war. This is the kind of person that Carrere was. And after the war, of course, he stayed in Spain, in Madrid, where he lived pretty much all his life, and leaned closer to the Franco regime in order to keep his journalistic license, and even wrote a novel in celebration of the new regime called The City of the Seven Daggers, or La Ciudad de los Siete Puñales. He must have had something going on with that number 7, because this is the Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, and that novel was The City of the Seven Daggers. However, the vast majority of the works by Carrere were not political, and many dealt with the underworld of Bohemian writers themselves. It was an underworld that he knew really well. For most of his life, in fact, Carrere lived quite comfortably, unlike many of these Bohemian writers, because he had a job as a civil servant, and at some point he inherited some money from his father. Therefore, his Bohemian lifestyle was a personal choice rather than brought about by necessity. He was a multifaceted writer, a poet, an essayist, a journalist. He appeared on radio. He wrote zarzuelas, which are the Spanish version of opera, etc. And he excels, however, as a narrator, especially as a writer of short novels or novelas cortas. He only wrote one long novel, this one right here, La Torre de los Siete Jorobados, which was first published in 1920. A great deal of his literary work is set in Madrid, since he lived there most of his life, and it was his hometown. So he has been called one of the great madrileñistas, which means writers who take the city of Madrid as their main subject matter or as the main setting of their works. And indeed, most of his short novels, and also this one here, the long novel, the only one long novel he wrote, they are set in Spain's capital. Carrere loved to walk around the city of Madrid, and he spent a lot of time in its cafes discussing literature and art with friends and writing his works in the cafes themselves, very often not showing up for work either. A sizable number of his works deal with the bohemian lifestyle and are set in cafes and feature artists as their main protagonists. They focus on many low-life characters, like poor artists and thieves and pimps and prostitutes and drunks, and many more. At his worst, Carrere can write works that are trite and predictable, but at his best, and here he is at his best, he is always able to treat all his subjects with dry humor and compassion. Be that as it may, Carrere is always a highly entertaining author, and that is why it's so sad that his works are not translated into English. He was also a poet, and as a poet he is often described as a modernist, and within modernism he can be best described as a decadentista, a man who was greatly influenced by Rubén Darío, was the main name in Spanish and Spanish-American modernism. Carrere was the first Spaniard who published an anthology of modernist poetry, including, of course, some of his own poems. It's called La Corte de los Poetas, or the Court of Poets, from 1906. His poetry can sometimes be a little repetitive, perhaps not as fresh, not as creative as that of modernist masters like Darío, but it does show a rather obvious influence of the works of French poets such as Rimbaud and Verlaine and Mallarmé from the 19th century, earlier even sometimes. Curiously, in his lifetime, Carrere was better known as a poet, and people from all walks of life knew his poems by heart. He was indeed a very popular poet in all senses of that word. They say that a lot of the prostitutes in Madrid really knew his poems by heart and would just recite them sometimes. I don't know in what situations, but that's what they say. Even today, most of the critical articles that one can find about Emilio Carrere deal primarily with his poetry, although that is slowly beginning to change. I am more interested in Carrere as a writer of fiction, if you haven't realized that already. And I think that as a writer of fiction, he was a master of the short novels, a genre about which not a lot has been written in Spain, though it was always there. The novelas cortas, the short novels, were always there in Spanish literature. We can go back to the picaresque novel of the 16th, 17th centuries. We can go back to Cervantes's exemplary novels, or novelas ejemplares, from 1613. The inset stories in Don Quixote can sometimes be considered also as short novels. And then there were all the writers like Maria de Zayas, even in the 17th century, that wrote their own short novels. But the short novel became particularly popular and attained a high readership at the turn of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, weekly publications that offered short novels at affordable prices began to appear. These were popular publications such as La Novela Corta, El Cuento Semanal, Los Contemporáneos, La Novela de Hoy, popular literature written by both established authors and newcomers. These publications have often been criticized by some critics for the low quality of the texts that they offered. But that is merely a generalization with which I beg to differ. Besides some of the newer writers of the era, renowned writers such as Emilia Pardo Bazán, Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, really popular in the United States actually, Pío Baroja, Valle Inclán, and many others contributed to these publications because they sold really well. It was a way to make fast cash. Carrere also contributed to almost all of these periodical publications, and his short novels were among the most popular. Their themes range from erotic to mystery, to adventure, to detective novels, to stories about the low life of Madrid. They usually have short chapters, short sentences with plenty of witty metaphors, very entertaining, very well written, and in many cases fairly easy to read, which accounts for their popularity. It's not that Carrere didn't know how to write in a more complicated way, but he just knew that if he kept it easy, it would be easier to sell. Both thematically and stylistically, Carrere was influenced by the likes of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Jules Verne, and Edgar Allan Poe, some of whose short stories, in fact, Poe stories, Carrere translated into Spanish using the French translation by Baudelaire as his main source. This is something Cortázar would do later on, Julio Cortázar, translating Poe from the French translation of Baudelaire. Carrere understood literature as a sort of business. He often republished the same texts with very few alterations and different titles. Sometimes he did not even bother to make any changes at all and simply switched the titles. But the text was exactly the same. Sometimes he would use a previously published short story and added some chapters to it in order to turn it into a short novel. He would also republish several novels in one volume and presented them as new and unpublished. As a result, Carrere is known as El Maestro del Refrito, which means the master of refried texts. Yeah, like refried beans, but in this case, refried text, because he kept refrying and reselling the same texts. And this makes his works very difficult to catalog, as you can imagine. Any attempt at creating a complete inventory of his works is doomed to fail. Some people have tried, but it's very difficult to do because of this republication and changes of titles and stuff like that. Carrere did not feel any sort of remorse regarding this practice of republication. In a letter to a friend, he even claims it is actually an honest practice. And I'll quote because this is quite interesting. It makes you think a little bit. He says, "Songwriters make money every time one of their songs is sung. And we, the writers, are only paid once when we sell something we write. We should receive royalties every time someone reads one of our poems, novels, or articles. Until we reach this sort of agreement, I will republish anything I want. It's just a matter of changing titles." Of course, he was selling his manuscripts. He wasn't making money off of the many copies of them that were sold every week. Let's talk about La Torre de los Siete Jorobados, or the Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, from 1920. It was first published in 1920, but in true Carrere fashion, it was based on a short story entitled El Señor Catafalco, or Mr. Catafalco, that Carrere had published a few years earlier. And then in turn, there's also another version which is called Un Crimen Inverosímil, an unbelievable crime. It's basically the same text as Mr. Catafalco, and from that, this novel evolved. It is the only full-length novel by Carrere, which is interesting because he did not seem to have written the whole text himself. A second writer, Jesus de Aragon, was brought in to pad it and make it longer. Carrere lengthened the aforementioned short story, Mr. Catafalco, and sold the manuscript to his publisher, but the novel still was not long enough to warrant publication as a full-length novel. So the publisher contacted him, and Carrere refused to make it longer. He said, "I've already sold it. What are we talking about? I'm not going to make this longer." So the publisher, Manuel Palomeque, was forced to find another writer that would lengthen the text, which is when Jesus de Aragon was brought in. Aragon was a newcomer trying to get his literary career started at the time and gladly took on the job. He would subsequently become a fairly popular writer of adventure novels, sometimes known as Spain's own Jules Verne, because he wrote adventure novels. And he often signed his works with the pseudonym of Capitan Sirius. Really good writer in his own right, also very obscure. And I've been doing also some research about him. Though it was once estimated that Jesus de Aragon wrote about half of the Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, later critics have argued that his contribution was actually a lot smaller. He probably just added a few chapters toward the middle of the novel and rewrote parts of others. In any case, it is again difficult to tell exactly how much Aragon wrote, but it seems that most of the novel still comes from Carrere's own pen. However much he actually wrote of the novel, as it was finally published in 1920, The Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks became one of Carrere's most popular titles, reissued several times throughout his life, but there aren't too many modern editions of it. This is one of them, and there's another one which is a critical edition that I also have, but I didn't bring. This novel is a mixture of different genres, a kind of pastiche of sorts. Adventure, mystery, detective, Gothic novel. And this is interesting, Gothic novel, because this genre wasn't cultivated in Spain too much. Not in the 19th century, not so much in the early part of the 20th century either. This is a good example of it, mixed with other genres. The plot of this novel moves at a very swift pace and concerns Basilio and a journalist known simply as El Duende de la Corte, or the Court Goblin, we don't know his real name, who investigate the mysterious murder of Mr. Catafalco. That's what's brought in from the previous short story. The real name of Mr. Catafalco turns out to be Dr. Robinson of Mantua, whose ghost appears unto Basilio while Basilio is gambling in a casino and communicates to Basilio that he has been murdered. This leads the two men, Basilio and the court goblin, to discover and enter into an obscure underworld that apparently exists in underground Madrid and that is governed by a strange cult, a secret sect of hunchbacks who perform rituals and sacrifices underground. So you see the mixture here of all different kinds of genres, lots of humor, lots of sometimes ridiculous situations. And I say, though seemingly ridiculous and often nonsensical, the plot is action-packed and remains interesting throughout its more than 200 pages. The novel features a great deal of fantastic elements and a background of occultism and theosophy, who are pseudosciences that Carrere was deeply interested in throughout his life. Carrere is also at his best in his use of humor in The Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, and his humor is often explicitly absurd. I'll give you an example. For instance, there's an underground scene in which a character has been kept as a prisoner in a pit. Basilio discovers this man, runs into him at some point, and before helping him out of the pit, he tells him, quote, "Sir, your situation is the same as that of the protagonist of The Pit and the Pendulum, The Chilling Tale by Edgar Poe. Do you like that author, sir?" And then, of course, he proceeds to help him out, but only after he answers the question. Let's talk, since I only have probably about 4 more minutes, Edgar Neville's 1944 film adaptation. The novel was very popular, and in 1944, over 2 decades after the original publication of this novel, noted Spanish playwright and filmmaker Edgar Neville directed a cinematic adaptation that remains one of the most obscure and underappreciated works in Neville's illustrious filmography, as well as in all of Spanish cinema. In fact, it is a movie that's really difficult to find nowadays, and to my knowledge, it has not yet been made available in any digital format, and definitely not available in the United States with English subtitles or anything like that, which is too bad, because it's a really interesting movie. For the film, Neville was forced to eliminate most supernatural elements and religious allusions due to the fact that he directed this movie just a few years after the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939. The movie's from 1944. At a time when censorship was particularly strict during the first decade of the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. So no supernatural elements, no religious allusions, no criticism of the church, of course, which you can find in the novel. By so doing, by eliminating all of these elements, Neville modified the novel in a decisive way, limiting the presence of the supernatural in the plot and concentrating much more on the elements of humor and detection present in the original story. Inevitably, he also gives more importance to a romantic subplot whose relevance is negligible in the novel. Of course, a romantic subplot is always interesting, and if you cannot concentrate on certain things you want to concentrate on, you would concentrate on the love story between a couple of characters, which is not really important in the novel. Throughout the film, however, and this is what's interesting and important, Neville proves to be greatly influenced by German expressionist cinema, that is, by the works of F.W. Murnau, and most of all by Fritz Lang's masterpiece, Metropolis from 1927. This becomes particularly apparent in Neville's depiction of the city of Madrid, the urban landscape of Madrid, and especially in the Gothic-like appearance that he chooses for the underworld that lies in the city's underground level, in which a great part of the film is set. A good example of this influence of the German expressionist cinema is in the Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks referenced in the title, which is a kind of Gothic-flavored inverted tower built not towards the sky, but towards the underground. Very expressionistic, if you can imagine. I wish I had a picture of it, but though Neville is forced to change the original plot of the novel, or perhaps precisely because he is made to do so in the light of the social and political context of the time, he achieves something in this film that is unique in Spanish cinema, at least to my knowledge. He is able to mix traditional elements of Spanish culture, precisely the kind that the new political establishment would appreciate and have absolutely nothing against, like Spanish theater, Spanish music, there's a little bit of flamenco here and there, he mixes this with more modern elements taken from German Expressionism that were not as common in the Spanish cinema of the 1940s for obvious reasons. The former, the traditional elements, are conveyed through the plot, which is much more traditional than that of Carrere's original novel. The latter, the more modern expressionist elements, are conveyed visually by means of the decor and the urban setting chosen to depict the city of Madrid. So he actually has his cake and eats it too, in that sense. Neville. Emilio Carrere would pass away in Madrid in 1947 at 65 years of age, just 3 years after the film's premiere. He remains one of the lesser-known writers of his generation, despite the incredible success that he knew in life. Edgar Neville would go on to make many more films and to write and direct several successful plays. Yet The Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks, La Torre de los Siete Jorobados, remains one of his least known and least studied works, a fascinating film that mixes the old and the new, the traditional and the modern, in a way of which I am sure Emilio Carrere himself must have approved without any reservations. Thank you very much for everything, and if you get a chance to watch this movie, if you know any Spanish, this really is a movie that I think you will enjoy. Thanks a lot.